Today we're going to be talking about muddy colors. What are they? Why are they such a problem with gouache? And how can we solve it so that we never have to deal with it again? I'm sure you've heard of the problem of muddy colors. This is when we start to paint and quickly run up against our colors not working together. You start to feel like we're just throwing mud around a canvas, which in a way we kind of are. Muddy colors ends up being one of these things that's actually really hard to solve if you're trying to look in the wrong places. And probably most of us are looking in the wrong places. So let's look at some of the ideas about what are muddy colors that may or may not actually have any credence to them. The first one is this idea that muddy colors happen when you put together a lot of muted colors, and that in order to get away from muddy colors, what we want to do is only use as bright and as vibrant colors as we possibly can. But it doesn't take us very long to actually dispel this particular myth. I want to look now at a couple of brilliant paintings by some fantastic artists, Sorolla, Monet, Richard Schmidt, and Peter Jablonski. And we're going to say pretty quickly that the idea that we're using colors that are too desaturated all the time, it's an idea that is understandable but doesn't actually hold to scrutiny. So first I want to look at this Richard Schmidt painting. And we're looking at this because really, aside from a couple of colors in here, this is all painted with some very desaturated muddy colors. But in the end, this is a painting that doesn't suffer from muddy color syndrome. So why is that? Here is probably one of our most saturated colors, right here in the hair. And it is not all that saturated. This is not a red straight out of the tube. Likewise, here's a green over here, and it's pretty dark, it's pretty desaturated. So what's going on? How can we have a painting that is so desaturated, so full of muddy colors, but doesn't actually hold the problem of muddy colors? The answer lies in the fact that this painting has clarity. While the colors might actually be muddy, they're held together by a very strong composition, by a very strong set of shapes. So what's happening in our main focal point has high contrast and high clarity in terms of these figures that are kissing. Likewise, these shoes down here and the bench off to the side have just enough clarity that they're holding the painting together without it feeling like it's being completely lost. And then finally, in the muddiest of places in this painting is a tree that has a very strong and clear shape. And so while this painting has all of the elements that would normally be associated with a muddy painting, we can see that having enough clarity in our shapes and in our values actually stops this muddy quality from actually being a problem whatsoever at all. And so here's the question: does the problem of muddy colors actually come from using desaturation? And does the solution to our problem then arise from using more saturated colors? And I think we can see the answer is no, but let's keep looking. Here we have a painting by Peter Jablonski. Likewise, this painting has all the ingredients of what would and probably should, by all means, be a painting suffering from muddy colors. But when we look at it, when we really dive into this painting, there's so much clarity brought together by the shapes and the values of what's happening here, that the muddiness of the colors, the desaturation, the mixing together of contrary colors, actually adds to the painting rather than subtracts from it. Here we have a painting on the beach by Sorolla, who likewise, in this instance, is actually using a lot of different colors. They're all mixing and merging together. They're all finding their way into the grays for the most part. However, the end result isn't a painting that is suffering from muddy colors. The end result is something that is really subtle and that actually holds a lot of color information, even if no particular part is screaming out the name of the color that's making it up. And last of all, here's a really famous piece by Claude Monet, who, of all of the paintings we looked so far, this is the one that should be screaming muddy colors to us. And when it comes to personal taste for me, perhaps it is a little bit, but it's muddy colors in the context of something that really actually holds this feeling. It is fully appropriate for what we're looking at. And then it's held together by some very solid, distinct shapes. So what can we learn from these four paintings? we learn that muddy colors isn't actually just about the fact that everything we're doing is desaturating. And the way these artists have gotten away with using muddy colors, not just gotten away with it, but they're the basis of what's happening in the painting and not the problem, is that each of these paintings are being brought together by really solid shapes and values. And it's the clarity of these shapes and values that are holding it together and not the saturation of the colors themselves. So if we want to start overcoming this idea of muddy colors and what it's doing to our paintings, we actually really need to learn the real culprit. And there are a number of real culprits, but the last of which is actually muddy colors. I even want to look at this painting, which is another painting by Richard Schmidt. And it's a really beautiful portrait. And in some ways, there's such a clarity in what's going on. Nothing about what's happening in this face or this hand is muddy at all whatsoever. But when we start getting to the background, he's actually kind of intentionally pulling together these colors that are starting to get muddy and starting to pull away from that clarity. You can see in this hand here, we have big, beautiful reds. And then as it comes down, we're introducing the greens of the background into this arm. And so what we're seeing is that not only is muddy colors not actually a problem, but rather that muddying our colors can be a solution, can be something that we can play with and have fun with. And so what this really is clarity of shape and clarity of values and clarity of colors, things that are really holding themselves together versus falling apart. And so when our shapes start to fall apart, when our colors start to become less identifiable and our edges become looser, this is when we start to get more muddy. So this is when we start to talk about, well, what are the solutions? These are all things that we can play with and have fun with and actually make a better painting by incorporating the idea of actually having some muddy colors in there. But let's get back to muddy colors as a problem in the way that we're feeling it. So we've talked about how actually it's not about saturated or desaturated. It's about clarity versus lack of clarity. And muddy colors is a lack of clarity. And so like in this last piece, a painting can start to become more muddy and still work fantastically, so long as our shapes and our values are being held together. And this is our number one question. When I encounter this feeling of muddy colors, which is why you clicked the video, because you've also encountered the feeling of muddy colors in your painting. The question isn't, oh, I need to have more pure colors. The first question should be, are my shapes and are my values clear? And what you'll find is in the places where you're having muddy colors as an issue, you're aiming for a clarity in shape and value and not achieving it. Your painting is needing some degree of clarity in shape and value and perhaps edge and not achieving it. So these are the first three things that we want to look at. What are my shapes? What are my values? And what are my edges? And 99% of the time, if you get your value and your shape and your edge right, then the feeling of muddy colors disappears. And you get to play around with your saturation to the point that it feels like you want it to feel, and use coming in and out of saturation as something that you can play with to benefit your painting to whatever degree you want to. And so the real question then for us as people who are painting with gouache is, why is gouache so much harder, and why is it so much more prevalent to come across muddy colors when I'm mixing with gouache? And the answer to this question is in what we've been talking about, in that quite a lot of the time, this feeling of muddy colors is going to disappear when our values become and remain clear. And gouache changes values when you place it down. Not only does it change values, but it changes saturation. And so we feel the loss of that saturation, but we suffer from the loss of that value. And so there's a couple of things that we can do to really dial in on getting on top of this feeling of muddy colors. So here's a couple of paintings of mine that by all rights should probably feel like they're suffering from muddy colors. And this one I'd say to some degree is. These are some paintings that I didn't actually get the time to finish, and so I didn't get to really dive into it. This one should be feeling muddy colors a lot more than it is if this is truly just about saturation. And the reason it's holding together so well is that we have really clear shapes and values in here. These are some rock formations up in the Appalachian Mountains, but I have some really clear form singing out here and some really clear shape moving in and out. And some of the areas that do suffer from muddy colors, like down here a little bit, are places where I haven't been able to really, just because of the time that I was spending there, get a clearer sense of what's happening in the form. And so then I have these colors that are mixing and merging together, and they're not representing form. And so there are some things like this rock right here, which if I had more time would have a darker core shadow right in the middle down here, which would turn it from feeling a little bit more two-dimensional into something that is more three-dimensional. And so the solution for this is adding in more value, more of that dark spot right down the middle to give it more of that three-dimensional form, instead of sitting here being a little bit more two-dimensional. The same with this rock and some of this even. The word that I like to think about instead of muddy colors is actually coherence. Coherence is just the idea that every little piece inside of here is also playing part in the big role of what's happening. And so are my values, my lights and my darks, do they actually sit together and communicate this really big form as it's turning? And if the answer is yes, then my values are coherent and they feel like they all fit together to do the same thing. And here I could push, and probably what I would have done if I'd stayed for longer, is push for more coherence in terms of my saturation and the colors that I'm going for. There's a really nice blue kind of sitting down here that I could push further, and contrast that to this really nice warmer sort of shadow in here that's already present. Yes, this actually has to do with color, but if I think in terms of coherence, how does the whole thing fit together? And how do all the different elements of value and color and edge, texture and transparency, how do they all fit together to tell one story? If they all work together and they're coherent, then muddy colors is not going to be a thing whatsoever at all. Here's another half-finished painting. This is a waterfall that I did, which I really loved, which again, if we're just talking about saturation and desaturation of color, then perhaps this should be a muddy painting. It even has a lot of just color blending into color, a lot of edges that are soft and fluffy and merging, but the shapes are really clear. So sometimes if you have an area like this, if my whole painting looked like this, where the shapes are a little indistinct and the values are a little indistinct, then this probably would actually feel like a pretty muddy painting. Like what's being said is inconsistent and not communicated really clearly. But then we have clarity. We have places like up here and even across down here that really what they're saying is very coherent. They're speaking really loudly up here and very softly down there. And so this is why these paintings that we just looked at worked, because while a good portion of it is muddy, other parts of it are really clear. And we get to hang the hats of our painting on the clarity in our painting and then leave a little bit of mystery behind. And this is a painting that does not suffer from muddy colors whatsoever at all. And this is what I want to talk about next. Gouache suffers from this feeling of muddy colors like we talked about. Most of the time that I put a color down, it's going to change in value as it dries. And so this becomes really difficult. Not only does it change in value, but it changes in saturation. 90% of the colors that we put down are going to actually become less saturated. And we really feel this. And so the idea is that when I'm putting down something like this orange underbelly, I'm going to grab our color and I'm going to mix it, and it's going to be even more saturated than what I'm seeing here. So that when I put it down, it's going to dry and it's going to desaturate to the point where I want it. When I put down this sort of saturated dark down here, I need to put it down so that as it dries and lands at exactly the saturation that I want. Now this is by no means easy, but this is the target, this is the goal. We have to overshoot in terms of our values and in terms of our saturation in order to actually land where we want it to land. If we're painting with really thick paint, where we have just enough water that it spreads evenly and nicely, then we want to paint about half a value lighter than what we're seeing most of the time. It's gonna dry, and it's gonna come down in value and land exactly where we want it to. As we're putting our colors down, we wanna overshoot the saturation. We want it to get more saturated than we're intending, so that when it dries, it comes back down and ends up at the saturation that we want. Part of the problem of gouache is that if you're painting and you mix your colors so that it looks exactly like what you're seeing in front of you, you're gonna place it down, the value is gonna change. And so that value structure that we talked about getting our values right and getting our shapes right, those shapes are gonna merge if they end up being separate values and then aligning as it dries, or they're gonna deviate. If I have a face that's painted and I put a color down to match when it's wet, and then suddenly what I just put down dries, it's now gonna be darker than the rest of my face. And so we have things coming in and out of coherence to really give us that feeling either of muddy colors or shapes that just fall apart. And while this does sound really complicated, what I want you to know is that once you get over that little initial learning period of figuring out how things are gonna dry in value and in saturation, then you don't have to think about it anymore. It becomes second nature. But more importantly than that is that even though those skills are involved in the problem of muddy colors, they're not at the core of the problem of muddy colors. And if instead of worrying about exactly where our color is going to land, we can make sure that our big values and our big shapes keep their clarity and cohesion, the rest of the painting is just going to fall into place, and we're not really going to have to suffer with the problem of muddy colors. Now, if you want to learn more about this, I have an 8-week class for frustrated artists who are trying to learn gouache and want to get to the point where they can bring their gouache with them on the go and paint life. That's my goal for myself, and that's my goal for all of my students. I also have a free online workshop called The Roadmap to Learning Gouache, where I talk about how I'd learn to paint with gouache if I were to have to start all over again. So if you're interested, I'd recommend coming and checking out either of those. The links to both of those are down below, and we can get to a point where we can fall in love with the process of painting and take our paints with us everywhere we go. I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you later.